Sir John Eliot was an English statesman who was serially imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he eventually died, by King Charles I for advocating the rights and privileges of Parliament. Family and early life. The son of Richard Eliot and Bridget Carswell, he was born at Cuttonbeak, a farm on his father's Port Eliot estate at St Germans in Cornwall. He was baptised on the 20th of April at St Germans Church, immediately next to Port Eliot. The Eliot family were an old Devon family that had settled in Cornwall. John Eliot was educated at Blundell's School, Tiverton, and matriculated at Exeter College, Oxford, on the 4th of December 1607, and, leaving the university after 3 years, he studied law at one of the Inns of Court. He also spent some months travelling in France, Spain and Italy, in company, for part of the time, with young George Villiers, afterwards 1st Duke of Buckingham. Parliamentary career. Eliot was only 22 when he began his parliamentary career as Member of Parliament for St Germans in the Adult Parliament of 1614. In May 1618, he was knighted, and next year through the patronage of Buckingham he obtained the appointment of Vice-Admiral of Devon, with large powers for the defence and control of the commerce of the county. It was not long before the characteristic energy with which he performed the duties in his office involved him in difficulties. After many attempts, in 1623, he succeeded by clever but dangerous manoeuvre in entrapping the famous pirate John Nutt, who had for years infested the southern coast, inflicting immense damage upon English commerce. However, the pirate, having a powerful protector at court in Sir George Calvert, the Secretary of State, was pardoned, while the Vice-Admiral, upon charges which could not be substantiated, was flung into the Marshalsea prison, and detained there nearly 4 months. A few weeks after his release, Eliot was elected Member of Parliament for Newport. On the 27th of February, he delivered his first speech, in which he at once revealed his great powers as an orator, demanding boldly that the liberties and privileges of Parliament, repudiated by James I in the former Parliament, should be secured. In the first Parliament of Charles I, in 1625, he urged the enforcement of the laws against the Roman Catholics. Meanwhile, he had continued the friend and supporter of Buckingham and greatly approved of the war with Spain. Buckingham's incompetence, however, and a bad faith with which both he and the king continued to treat the Parliament, alienated Eliot. Distrust of his former friend quickly grew in Eliot's mind to a certainty of his criminal ambition. Returned to the Parliament of 1626 as member for St Germans, Eliot found himself, in the absence of other leaders of the opposition whom the king had secured by nominating them sheriffs, the leader of the House. He immediately demanded an inquiry into the recent disaster at Cadiz. On the 27th of March, he made an open and daring attack upon Buckingham and his administration. He was not intimidated by the king's threatening intervention on the 29th of March, and persuaded the House to defer the actual grant of the subsidies and to present a remonstrance to the king, declaring its right to examine the conduct of ministers. On the 8th of May, he was one of the managers who carried Buckingham's impeachment to the Lords, and, on the 10th of May, he delivered the charges against him, comparing him in the course of his speech to Sejanus. Next day, Eliot was sent to the Tower. When the Commons declined to proceed with business as long as Eliot and Sir Dudley Diggers were in confinement, they were released, and Parliament was dissolved on the 15th of June. Eliot was immediately dismissed from his office of Vice-Admiral of Devon, and, in 1627, he was again imprisoned for refusing to pay a forced loan, but liberated shortly before the assembling of the Parliament of 1628, to which he was returned as member for Cornwall. He joined in the resistance now organized to arbitrary taxation, was foremost in the promotion of the Petition of Right, continued his outspoken censure of Buckingham, and after the latter's assassination in August, led the attack, in the session of 1629, on the Ritualists and Arminians. In February the great question of the right of the king to levy tonnage and poundage came up for discussion, on the king ordering an adjournment of Parliament. The Speaker, Sir John Finch, was held down in the chair by Denzil Hollis and Benjamin Valentine, while Eliot's resolutions against illegal taxation and innovations in religion were read to the House. In consequence, Eliot, with 8 other members, was imprisoned on the 4th of March in the Tower. He refused to answer in his examination, relying on his parliamentary privilege, and on the 29th of October was again sent to the Marshalsea. On the 26th of January, he appeared at the bar of the King's Bench, in front of Lord Chief Justice Sir Nicholas Hyde, with Hollis and Valentine, to answer a charge of conspiracy to resist the King's order, and refusing to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the court. He was fined £2,000 and ordered to be imprisoned during the King's pleasure until he had made submission. This he steadfastly refused. While some of the prisoners appear to have had certain liberty allowed to them, Eliot's confinement in the Tower was made exceptionally severe. Charles's anger had always been directed chiefly against him, not only as his own political antagonist but also as the prosecutor and bitter enemy of Buckingham, an outlawed man. He described him, desperate in mind and fortune, death and burial. In the spring of 1632, he fell into a decline. In October he petitioned Charles for permission to go into the country, but leave could be obtained only at the price of submission and was finally refused. He died of consumption on the 27th of November 1632, and was buried at St. Peter's Advincula Church within the Tower. When his son requested permission to move the body to St. Germans, Charles refused, saying, "Let Sir John Eliot be buried in the church of that parish where he died." The suspicious manner of Eliot's death, as the result of the king's implacability and severe treatment, had more effect, probably, than any other single incident in embittering and precipitating the dispute between king and parliament. Eliot was a great orator, inspired by enthusiasm and high ideals, which he was able to communicate to his hearers by his eloquence. In 1668, the House of Lords reversed his conviction, restating the law in Strode's case, affirming that the conviction was an illegal judgment, and against the freedom and privilege of Parliament. Works. Eliot languished in prison for some time, during which he wrote several works. Negotium Postrorum, an account of the Parliament in 1625. The Monarchy of Man, a political treatise. De Jure Majestatis, a political treatise of government, which is in large part a summary of a work by Henning Arnesaeus. An apology for Socrates, his own defense. Family. In 1611, Eliot married Radegund, daughter of Richard Jeddy of Trabursai in Cornwall, by whom he had 5 sons and 4 daughters. John Eliot, who married Honora Norton. Richard Eliot. Elizabeth Eliot, who married Nathaniel Fiennes. Edward Eliot, who married Anna Fortescue. Bridget Eliot, who married Peter Fortescue. Radegunda Eliot. Susanna Eliot, who married Edward Norton. Thomas Eliot. Nicholas Eliot, who married a Miss Prideaux. Peregrine Nicholas Eliot, 10th Earl of St. Germans, is descended from the youngest son, Nicholas. Richard Eliot. Richard Eliot was the wayward second son of Sir John Eliot and Radegund Geddy. Richard went to the University of Oxford at his father's suggestion, but did not fare well with academic life. He became embroiled at Oxford in various difficulties, which are mentioned without further detail in his father's writings. Further problems ensued when Richard failed or refused to visit his father in the Tower. As a result, Richard seems to have disappeared compared to his siblings. It is known that he went to the Low Countries under Sir Edward Howard around February 1632. Richard died before 1669 when his brothers, John and Edward, argued over the inheritance of Richard's lands in Cornwall. General Granville Elliot spent much time and effort trying to prove that Richard Elliot had married Catherine Killigrew, and had a child, George Eliot, born around 1636. However, documents survive that show that Richard died a bachelor, and that, in 1656, Catherine was known as a spinster aged 38. It is likely, however, that George Eliot was the illegitimate son of Richard and Catherine.